Don.
Sammy Gravano was the power behind the throne.
When the feds closed in, Gravano made a decision that would put his boss behind bars for life and decimate New York's most powerful crime family.
As a member of our family's administration, I helped John Gotti run the family. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Salvatore Gravano. Early in my life, I was given the nickname Sammy the Bull.
In a working-class neighborhood of Brooklyn called Bensonhurst, people would whisper about the Mafia, about men who were connected. Sammy Gravano, the highest-ranking mobster ever to testify against his boss, was born here on March 12, 1945. Young Sammy grew up in this house with his parents and two older sisters. He kept pictures of James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart on the walls of his room. His parents were Sicilian immigrants who ran a small dress factory. On their way to Sunday Mass, Sammy and his father would pass a corner saloon where gangsters congregated.
He noticed his father always walked on the other side of the street. And Sammy, he kept saying, "Who are these people? Who are those men, Dad?" And finally, his father said, "Well, they're bad people, but they're our bad people."
It was these men who gave Sammy his nickname. He had just turned 10, and someone had stolen the bicycle his parents had given him for his birthday. Gravano spotted two older boys with his bike across the street from the saloon. He ran over and tried to slug it out with both of them. A mafioso stepped in and gave Sammy his bike back.
And as the mafioso walks back across the street, he yells to the other guys hanging out there, "Do you see this little Sammy? He's like a little bull." And that's how he got the name, Sammy the Bull.
While Gravano earned the admiration of mobsters, he was not winning compliments from his school teachers. At Shallow Junior High, he was held back twice. Sammy's parents were told their son was a slow learner. He was, in fact, dyslexic.
He started beating up some of the boys in the class who had been mocking him. And as he said, they stopped all the laughing. He said, "That was the first time I found out violence paid."
One day when he was about 13 years old, Sammy got drunk and ended up in the principal's office. As the principal was lecturing him, Sammy stood up and punched the man, breaking his jaw. Gravano was expelled and eventually ended up in a school for juvenile delinquents. Sammy would occasionally lend a hand at his parents' dress factory. It was there he got another look at the Mafia. Two union thugs appeared one day and tried to extort his father for using non-union labor. They vowed to return the next week to collect. Sammy got a hold of the gun and was ready to use it to protect his father. But when the two thugs showed up again, Sammy's father wielded a more powerful weapon.
His father mentioned the name of a guy he knew from the old country, a gangster named Sebito. And all of a sudden, the two guys changed their tune immediately. They knew right away that Sammy's old man was not a guy to fool around with because he knew somebody in the mob. At that point, Sammy realized the power that gangsters had.
Sammy's father had shown he was not above calling on that power himself, but he tried to keep his son from choosing the life of a gangster. He had struggled to provide a comfortable lifestyle for his family. There was a car and even a Long Island summer cottage. But Sammy saw a shortcut to wealth and acceptance.
Sammy Gravano, growing up, looked at his father and said, "That looks too hard. You know, I'm looking around, I'm seeing the American dreams, I'm seeing big cars and wads of money and people who don't really seem to have to work for it. I want to be one of those guys."
By the time he was 16, he had dropped out of school and was committing burglaries and stealing cars with a Bensonhurst street gang known as the Rampers. Sammy and his friends in the gang took an oath. They would stick together forever. But Gravano was forced to leave his gang behind in 1964. He was drafted into the Army, and sent off to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training. Sammy was small, just 5 feet 5 inches, but he made up for it in toughness. To his surprise, the 19-year-old grew to like being a soldier, the rules and traditions, the hierarchy. Gravano attained the rank of corporal just as the war in Vietnam was heating up.
He said, you wouldn't mind staying in the Army and going to Vietnam. He said they gave medals to you for killing people.
But Sammy was never sent overseas, and when his 2-year hitch was over, he left the Army, returned to Bensonhurst, and fell back in with the Rampers. In 1968, a fellow gang member introduced the Bull to his uncle, Tommy Shorty Spiro. Shorty was an associate in New York's Colombo crime family. He recruited Sammy into his crew of burglars. Gravano was 25 when Shorty ordered him to kill another crew member named Joseph Colucci. It was his first murder assignment. The reason behind the killing had to do with Colucci's wife. Shorty's nephew was having an affair with her and wanted to marry her. For Sammy, the reason hardly mattered, nor that Colucci was a friend of his. Carrying out the first hit, what mobsters call making your bones, was a vital step in becoming a member or made guy in the Mafia.
He believed in the Cosa Nostra principles. And the principles are, when the boss tells you somebody has to go, he goes.
Colucci was riding in the front seat of a '64 Riviera on February 28, 1970, after a night of club hopping. Sammy the Bull sat right behind him. Gravano pulled out a .32 caliber pistol and shot Colucci twice in the back of the head.
He said he felt like he could feel the bullet leaving the gun, and to take a man's life didn't repel him. It gave him a sense of importance and power that he was now in a position where, sanctioned by some secret society, he could be the instrument that caused someone to live or die.
Jackie Colucci learned of her brother's death the next morning.
Sammy and all the crowd, all the boys came in and started crying and hugging us and saying, we're going to find out who did this to Joey. Don't worry. You know, we'll find out what happened.
Sammy had made his bones and was on his way to becoming a made guy. His stock in the Colombo crime family soared. That is, until he started feuding with Shorty's brother. Shorty settled the matter by arranging for the Bull to get a Mafia transfer. He left the Colombo family and joined another one, the Gambinos, then the most powerful in New York City. By now, Gravano had started a family of his own. When Sammy met 17-year-old Deborah Schibetta, her innocence caught his attention. They married less than a year later, in April 1971. Sammy would later say they were like wolves who mate and stay together for good. Deborah understood the world she was entering. An uncle was a mob captain.
She was strong-minded. She was not flashy. She was good-looking. And she loved Sammy, and Sammy loved her.
The couple had a daughter, Karen, and later a son, Gerard. The biggest day of Sammy's life, however, was neither his wedding nor the birth of his children. It came in 1976, when Gambino crime boss Paul Castellano inducted Sammy the Bull Gravano into La Cosa Nostra. Castellano kissed the 31-year-old gangster on both cheeks. He decreed, "I am the boss. I am the father of the family. I am your God." In less than a decade, Sammy would betray that oath, joining a plot to murder the father of the family. A plot masterminded by a man to whose fate Gravano would forever be linked, John Gotti.
I became a made member of the Gambino family in 1976. At that time, Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino family. John Gotti, I, along with some others, murdered Paul Castellano. We took over the family.
Sammy the Bull Gravano met the man who would one day become his crime boss, John Gotti, at an after-hours club in Bensonhurst in 1978. The two gangsters were complete opposites. Gotti was flashy and loved the New York nightlife. Gravano was low-key and enjoyed playing chess, a game perfectly suited to his competitive nature and his obsession with rules and hierarchy. The two men sized each other up.
Each of them knew of the other. Each of them had a reputation in their own neighborhoods. And each of them filed away the introduction. And it was kind of a mutual admiration society for a long time between John Gotti and Sammy Gravano.
Gotti was an unofficial mob captain, busy hijacking cargo at JFK Airport. Sammy was just making his mark in a racket that required more intelligence, one that would make him a rich man: construction. Gravano had started by taking over a drywall company and opening a plumbing company. When boss Paul Castellano had water pressure problems at his Staten Island mansion, Sammy did the boss a favor and sent his workers over to fix it. Sammy impressed Castellano. They began meeting one-on-one. The Bull saw in his crime boss a fellow businessman, someone who could help him get to the top.
Castellano, in Sammy's view, was the best thing since sliced bread. An intelligent, smart guy. Sammy would go and see him, and he'd be sitting there in his silk gown reading the Wall Street Journal.
Big Paul and the Gambino family controlled several labor unions in the construction business. If a contractor wanted to avoid work slowdowns or use cheaper non-union labor, he had to do business with companies owned or controlled by the mob. In return for a sizable chunk of the profits, the mob boss gave Sammy his blessing and put the unions behind him. By the early 1980s, Gravano was flourishing.
We had like 2 companies in the beginning, and then as time went on, there were 2 or 3, 4 companies added on. That, you know, it was that's when I started saying to myself, this guy's opening up a lot of different companies here. You know, something must be expanding his horizons.
Gravano was known as a shrewd businessman who did good work. But people who called on Sammy's influence and went into business with him sometimes found they got more than they bargained for.
What they probably didn't all count on was that over time, Gravano would be more than lending a hand, that he would be taking over their business and that they would be out, and in some cases later they would be dead. But that is the way the world of organized crime works. It is all about the threat of force, then the use of force, and ultimately murder to achieve one goal, which is to make money.
The Bull was not only earning a reputation as a big money maker for the Gambino crime family, the boss knew he could also count on Sammy as a killer. In 1980, boss Castellano ordered the murder of a Philadelphia capo named Johnny Keys Simone. This time, Gravano was not the trigger man. Sammy formed his own crews now to carry out mob executions that he planned.
He says, you don't have to be a genius to pull the trigger. That's the easiest part of it. It's setting it up. It's making sure it's done.
In his rise up the Mafia ladder, Sammy would not let anyone stand in his way, not even members of his own family. Sammy's brother-in-law, Nick Shibetta, was a low-level crime associate whose cocaine and alcohol problems, along with his homosexuality, had become an embarrassment in the underworld. There were fears he might become an informant. Gravano asked the boss for permission to kill his brother-in-law. Big Paul approved the hit.